where the word slum came from. The dictionary simply says a slum is a city district marked by squalor and wretched living conditions. Slums begin to grow almost as soon as the city is born. As the paint flecks away and the cracks creep their way across the ceiling, a slum starts to take shape. And then one day the slum is there, tucked under the freeways, hidden behind the factories and on the other side of town. If we look, we can see it. But we look the other way, because it's not a pleasant picture. But something is happening in our slums, and it's time we take a look. In this report, we shall see the decline and fall of the slum, and the rise and reconstruction of a second city. Most large American cities were settled about 150 years ago. But it's only been in the last 100 years that they flourished, and only 50 years ago that they mushroomed into something called a metropolis. No neighborhood is born a slum. Where the unemployed, the Negro, and the migrant now live was once the home of the rich. But the wealthy of one generation died, and their sons moved farther out to build newer homes. And slowly, through the years, the houses changed hands. And those hands belonged to poor people in every decade. And then, one day, we realized that the mansion of the past had become the slum of the present. But we didn't pay much attention. Our thoughts and energy were directed at two wars and a depression. If we thought about the slum at all, it was at Thanksgiving or Christmas when we packed a basket full of canned goods for those less fortunate than ourselves. But when we came home from the last World War, we began to look around at our cities, and some of us didn't like what we saw. We found crime was increasing, and infectious diseases like tuberculosis were spreading. The cries of hungry children became louder, and the terrible tenement fire was all too frequent on our front pages. Those of us who weren't so touched by human wants found out that slums, above all else, were expensive. It cost more to police these slums and put out the fires here than it did elsewhere in the city. It took more public health nurses and unemployment checks to care for people here. And while the slum demanded more and more of our public funds, it paid back less and less in taxes. The slums were like the cancerous growth around the heart of our city. If we didn't cut them out, they would soon eat us up. Something had to be done before the decay became so great that rigor mortis set in. The city was sick. The slums were its cemetery. Something had to be done. But what? And more importantly, how? You just don't drive up in a bulldozer and mow down 40 or 50 acres of building. It costs money, enormous amounts of money to tear down slums. Slums are owned by people. Must pay them for their property. Then wrecking crews must be paid to tear them down and clear away the broken bricks. Legal titles must be acquired for all the separate pieces of property. A place to live where all those who are forced out must be found. And then finally, someone has to rebuild a city where the slum once was. It would be easier to build a new city than to remake the old one in many ways. Some said, let private enterprise do it. But private enterprise has neither the money nor the legal power to do the job. And it is not the task of private enterprise to find new homes for thousands of displaced families. The city government, already burdened by new problems of booming population, just didn't have the money. In response to this need, the Congress of the United States passed the Housing Act of 1949. This was the birth of urban renewal. The Congress declared that the federal government would pay 2/3 of the cost of clearing the slums if the cities paid the rest. But with a firm belief in private enterprise, the lawmakers decreed that the land should be sold back to private interests to rebuild. The struggle to save our cities was on. The first battleground for slum clearance in Columbus was a section of the city called Flytown. In this area, just north of downtown, thousands of families were crammed together in ramshackle houses. It was a filthy neighborhood full of despair. One old man, now 83 years old, remembers it as a place of fear.
The kids around over there. Yes, there was. With shoot. I knew a colored fellow over there that he was shot in the head though with a brick over. He didn't kill him instantly. So, no, I didn't visit around. I was working over there at the hotel. I was putting a lot of time over this hotel. Yes, and I didn't go anywhere because I was just back and forth to my work. Yes, I didn't go. That's mean over there. Fly down. That's right. Right? God Almighty, excuse saying good God Almighty, but Lord have mercy, there wasn't a lot of them over there, and I had a rifle. And doggone if I wouldn't sit there on the step and kill a whole lot of rats. Oh yes, sir, they was bad over there. And the coal house where I kept coal, it started in there, and I was really good with a rifle. Doggone, I'd knock them winding those before they'd get in there. Yes, sir. Rats, bad, Lord have mercy. You just feel like a groundhog. You better stay in your hole and you can travel around over there. They bump you off. And I didn't go anywhere. I was on this back and forth to come awake. Well, I tell you, man, I was speaking, I just saw like a bird. If you cage a bird up, if you let him out to how happy he be, I was happy with him. To get away from over there.
There were many who were glad to get away from there. In the late 1950s, the city purchased these slums, and thousands of people began a new life somewhere else. In 1958, surgery was performed on Flytown by the bulldozer. A few months later, it was a barren desert awaiting a new life. The city was surrounded by other neighborhoods of painful decay, too. On the eastern border of downtown were some of the worst slums. This was Market Mohawk, and it was the next target for attack. Here, thousands more were submerged in the filth of rotten houses. Once again, the grandeur of the past had become the misery of the present. Once again, the bulldozer leveled the landscape. Further east, streets lined with dilapidated houses surround Children's Hospital. The houses have been condemned. They now await the blow of the executioner's wrecking crane. And so the slums, which took a half a century to mature, have fallen in just 6 short years. But other slums remain, and perhaps the worst is yet to fall. This is the Mount Vernon Avenue area. It's on the drawing board for the next 2 years. But destroying the slum does not solve the problems of the people who created the slum. Tearing down buildings and putting up new ones is simple compared to rebuilding human character. There is a seething argument about this thing called urban renewal in our area today. Last November, a $6 million urban renewal bond issue failed to get 55% of the vote and went down to defeat by a hair. And that opened the Pandora box for urban renewal, and out jumped all its enemies. The critics charged the people didn't want whatever urban renewal was, and the vote, they said, proved it. Let us now look at the present progress and decide if we want to veto the future. In the beginning, urban renewal was a bold and desperate plan to wipe the slums from our city. It had to be bold because it was dealing with a disease which had 100 years head start. So it crashed and smashed away at the slums like a giant crushing a tiny village as it walked across the landscape. But people are more important than acres. In these almost unbearable conditions stood 1,500 buildings, and in these houses, more than 6,000 families fought for something called survival.
Some of it was 4 or 5 bedrooms, and with the conditions of the walls and with the bring insects and we had trouble keeping the house warm. It was harder to heat because of the conditions of the inside. So it was, I couldn't describe it. Things like roaches and rats, they really treated down there. Staring at the walls with the plaster and stuff about, well, they still would, deep, hiding there, sitting down and come out. But the neighborhood was dirtier than the neighborhood I'm living in now, because people didn't take care of the garbage. There was a lot of garbage. There was a lot of junk and different things around that would be rats and roaches.
When these people left the rats and roaches and the slums, where did they go? Did they just begin new slums somewhere else? Did they make a mass exodus to the public housing projects? The record to date shows that only 4% moved to worse housing, another 11% signed up for public housing, and 85%, the vast majority, bought or rented houses in widely scattered areas around the city. How could these people who lived in slums afford to buy or rent better housing? They were able to do this through various government loan programs, and the emphasis is on loans. The money was loaned, not given to them. Some were able to move to better housing because they were being overcharged by slum lords where they used to live. One of the legitimate criticisms of urban renewal is that it rewards the slum lord by buying his property. When people leave a slum, they take part of their past with them, but they nevertheless go forward into the future. But when they move to some different place where no rats run down the halls and toilets are inside, their outlook on life does sometimes change. Well, one of the things about slum clearance is that it does break up the old neighborhood and spreads it around. In a new neighborhood, if everybody works and all the kids go to school, it becomes catching, and some people begin to change. About 10% of the people who used to live in the slum area don't make enough money to buy or rent elsewhere. And so public housing enters the picture. In public housing, they pay rent according to their salary. It provides them a decent, clean place to live at rent they can afford. But public housing has some drawbacks. It puts a charity tag on people. It isolates them on an island for everyone to see. It tends to group together people with the same problems and gives them no better example to follow. And it has the look of an institution about it. It's expensive, too. The average cost of building one apartment here is $17,000. For that kind of money, you could buy a new house on the open market. There is nevertheless a need for public housing. At its worst, it's far better than the old slums. But the kind of public housing we're now building may not be right for the people who live there or the time. We need to take a hard look at public housing and decide if it's the right answer. What happens once the slums are gone? Who fills this vast void of land? Some cities have swept away their slums, only to find that no one wants to rebuild the central city. And downtown, in some places, has become a ghost town. Once the slums are gone, the city's role becomes much smaller. The city government cannot replace the cleared area with new life. This has always been the job of free enterprise in our system. Some cities have sold the properties piecemeal to whomever would buy. But this is a slow process, which has often been unsuccessful. Columbus is one of the first cities in the nation to try the single developer plan. Now, this means one private firm handling all the lots, then bringing others in to build new structures. Just 6 years ago, Plytown was a slum that cost the taxpayers $78,000 just to have around. Today, that same area has 8 new buildings up or under construction, which are worth $20 million, and which pay the city back more than $250,000 in taxes. The Market Mohawk area, which has just been cleared, already has 1 new hotel going up, and $40 million worth of new projects are on the drawing board. The Children's Hospital project was another neighborhood that was falling apart and costing the taxpayers a lot of money. They haven't even finished clearing it yet. One of the finest children's medical centers in the nation will rise out of these ruins. What does all this cost the local taxpayer? The price tag is the original $5 million which the taxpayers voted in 1958. The return will be $100 million worth of new buildings, which won't need much policing. By any standards, urban renewal has already been a whopping financial success in Columbus. The city should be proud of these new buildings, but there are some questions that might be asked about the new city. In some ways, if you have seen one redevelopment project, you've seen them all. Too often, they are a series of high-rise buildings set against a green blanket of grass that seems to say, keep off. Children are hard to find, and car washing is a thing of the past. Like public housing, the new developments are islands, isolated from the rest of the city. And sometimes it's hard to tell the luxury apartments from the public housing on the outside. But investors are risking a lot of money on these projects, and it's hard to get them to try some new, untried design. Perhaps the people who design these developments should ask themselves whether they would want to live in these projects themselves. The city does have a say-so in how these buildings are to be built. Maybe they should exert more influence on what kind of structures are put up. After all, like the slums that are gone, these new developments are also going to stand for the next century. Urban renewal is not one program. It is many. For instance, urban renewal is closely tied to expressway building. As the new superhighways and interchanges cut their way across America, they cross and recross the city. Fortunately, they have been designed to cut through the slums, thereby serving two needs at the same time. Part of the three clearance areas in Columbus came about as a result of freeway construction. The freeways feed the traffic into the city to work, but at night they also become escape routes to suburbia. The new middle-class America does not want to live in the big city, so they seek new housing in a cluster of bedroom communities that surround the central city. There is a vast move on to pull all these towns together in a single common interest, but still there is frustration. The people who live outside cannot vote on city programs, and the city government finds too many of its residents escaping out the freeways at 5 to leave the city with its problems. The planners and politicians have their work cut up for them if they're going to avoid a giant clash of interests in the future. Urban renewal and expressways share another common interest, too. 90% of the cost of these new highways is paid for with federal funds. The city and state only put up the other 10%. Nobody seems to mind that, though. In contrast, the city pays 25% of urban renewal, and the federal government contributes the rest. By some strange logic, that should make urban renewal more acceptable to those who think federal aid is wrong. If we had refused federal aid for highways, then our cities would still be clogged with two-lane roads. If we had turned down federal money for slum clearance, the slums would still be there, and the new buildings would be only dreams. But all this talk of federal aid is quibbling with words. Washington only gives back what it takes from us in taxes. And unless the whole system of government is drastically changed, federal aid is going to be with us for a long time. And as long as the federal government is distributing our money, we might as well get as much of it back as we can. Looking at it this way, urban renewal is a good investment. For every dollar we spend, we get back $2 from Washington to clear slums. The image of urban renewal in the past has been the bulldozer mowing down the old to make way for the new. But the program is now in the second stage of development, and the drone of the dozer is being replaced by the bang of a hammer. Not all that is old is worthless. The past has its place. There are many older neighborhoods in Columbus, which were once places of beauty and excellence. They are now in the first stage of becoming slums. But they can be saved and revived. They can be changed into homes that people will pay a high price to have. The Denison Avenue area south of the Ohio State University is an area that was scheduled for saving, but the voters turned down the money to do the job last November. And if we're going to prevent future slums, which are a breeding place for every kind of trouble, we're going to have to pay more attention to our housing laws. There are places in our city right now where new slums are being built. They are bright and shiny new now, but 10 or 20 years from today, they'll be falling apart. Some who condemn urban renewal claim that it is nothing more than a program designed to dole out money to worthless people who won't work for a living. They say the old slums weren't so bad, but those who say that never lived there.
They were fire traps, most of them. Like I say, a lot of the places had maybe only one or two exits, and a lot of the children was on the upper floors. They couldn't possibly get out. I know one house in particular had 4 or 5 families living in it and a bunch of children, and only one bath facility for all of them. And it was terrible. It really was. I don't know. You can move people other places, and if they don't have decency in them, I don't believe anything can change them, frankly. But I believe most of the people down there were decent. They were honest people, but they just, the circumstances, they just couldn't pay the high rent. My biggest concern was my children, that they had no yard to play, and it told on them because they couldn't get out and play, and I wouldn't let them out on the street. You read so much in the paper of molestings and children out on the street, and there wasn't too far from us. A little boy and his sister had been taken, and I was too afraid to have my children out.
A great many persons who move from the slums find a new hope in life and succeed. To stop this disease, we must get through to their children and place our hope in the second generation. This is why our best teachers and our finest schools should be in our worst areas. We must reclaim the next generation. In the final analysis, urban renewal is not a simple thing. It's complicated, tremendously complicated. It does not involve one single idea. It is a mass of different problems. You can't tell the story of what's happening in a half an hour. What's happening here takes a lifetime to change. But it's only been a working concern for 6 short years. There are some important things to remember. If we had waited for our cities to rebuild themselves, we would still have the slums. To those who ask why urban renewal hasn't moved faster, the answer must be that a gigantic job has already been done. The worst slums are gone, and others will go soon if the program has a chance. And in half a dozen years, we've made a sizable dent in the filth and decay that was strangling our cities. And finally, what of those who were once here? They did not move to new luxury penthouses, but they were glad to leave the slums anyway.
In a way I was, because I guess I'd have been sitting there 5 or 10 or 15 more years. I was glad. I hate moving, but I was glad that we were able to sort of better ourselves. Of course, it's not too much different here. It's a little better, more room, but there's a lot of repair to be done out here. Hope in the future I'll be able to get into one of the projects and sometimes I think they're better than trying to get into big quarters. I hope it'll be a whole lot different than what I had. It seems like they're making progress now toward making Thomas a better area for the children, be better school grounds, and used to be like it is now.
No, things aren't the way they used to be. They're a little bit better now because of urban renewal. Mistakes have been made in urban renewal, and more will be made in the future. When you try to undo the neglect of centuries, there's bound to be a few stumbles along the way. But the battle must be fought if the war is to be won. And whatever the errors of the past, urban renewal is making a brighter future. The city is a far better place in which to live and work today. If there is a person who would prefer the slums of the past to the growth of the present, let him now stand and be recognized. In summary, this must be said. Much has been done. There is much more left to do. We can sit in our suburbs and let the city die. Or we can save it, and in saving it, save ourselves. The choice is ours to make.